Hey, folks, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring podcast. Today, we're going back over to England, where they've been having a bunch of distilleries that I've had on recently, and I just love exploring them. It's a whole new scene with let's say, a remarkably independent profile from what you might expect from their very close neighbors, and one that I'm thrilled to feature. So, today, we are talking about White Peak Distillery. And to talk about it, we have one of the co-founders, Max Vaughn. And I say co founder because it would be a shame not to mention that his wife, Claire, is also a co founder, something he's corrected in multiple interviews before. So, Max, welcome on.
Yeah, hi David. Yeah, great to be on, and yeah, thanks for the shout out to Claire as well.
Absolutely. So, I do want to also do a shout out to Brian Luffman. He was a guest on the podcast last year for Never Say Die and introduced Max and I back, I know, at some point in between there. And there will be one or two others that get shout outs as well through the interview. So, with that, let's start off where we usually do, the origin story of the distillery, and then we'll get into the more nerdy questions after that. So, Max, I'll throw it to you for the origin story of White Peak.
Yeah, thanks, David. So I guess dialing back probably 3 decades, so well before we had any kind of dream of starting our own distillery. I've been a lifelong whiskey fan, and something I inherited from my father. He was a member of the Scotch Malt Whisky Society, and so yeah, he was always yeah, kind of enticing me to try some of the latest single cask, often cask strength whiskies that he got through that membership. Anyways, I developed let's just say a sort of a reasonable interest in whiskey. I wouldn't say I had a an encyclopedic knowledge, but I, I I loved whiskey. I really enjoyed a lot of the whiskey distilleries that I used to visit, and I think yeah, just that history of whiskey making. Anyway, so wind forward the clock to probably around about 12 years ago. I was aware of someone starting an urban distillery in a place called Battersea in just one of the London suburbs. And I think, yeah, as I was kind of being told the story, it kind of sowed a seed in my mind that that's what I'd love to do. One day I'd love to start my own whiskey distillery. So yeah, it kind of it grew from there. So I wasn't working in drinks or spirits. I've never worked in whiskey. I'd never made any whiskey. But I certainly had this dream of starting a whiskey distillery in the region of the UK where I'm from. And yeah, I kind of did my best to put together a sort of a business plan, and made a lot of phone calls and had people recommended to me I should speak to, and slowly but surely kind of convinced myself and also Claire that this was something that we should seriously consider. And I think yeah, probably after 4 or 5 years of finessing the plan, it kind of got to a point where it was either yeah, let's jump in and get wet, or let's kind of consign the business plan to history. And yeah, so we decided to give it a go. So that's kind of the just the general background to yeah, why it is we started a distillery. Yeah, and there's lots more specifics that I'm happy to share, David, but that's the simple background.
Actually, and I do want to just throw in here, because I heard this on an interview where you mentioned one of the guys from who was making the Battersea Distillery. Um, that was the London Distillery Company.
That's correct. That's correct. And it was a guy. I think there were two people involved, is my recollection, but the person whose name kind of stuck in my mind and who I've subsequently met was a guy called Darren Rook.
Mhm.
And in fact, he's been up to Derbyshire, where our distillery is, to visit White Peak Distillery. but yeah, their endeavors in London, back in the day, were certainly kind of an inspiration for us.
Gotcha. I only picked up on that because very recently I had on Matt McKay, who's taken over London Distillery Company in their new iteration. So I was like, I know Battersea. I've heard that recently. So
Yeah,
um,
yeah, no, I know Matt. I knew him in his previous role at Bimber, and I actually knew him before that. We met at a whiskey festival. Yeah, I'm going to say 2017, something of that nature.
mhm.
I think, yeah, it was certainly very early on for us. We had our new make spirit at the festival, but that was all we had.
Yep. So this place, you're in Derbyshire, which if you're looking at it on paper is Derbyshire, but pronounced Derbyshire. You and Claire both grew up there. You went to school there. You met there, and putting aside some years in London for jobs and what have you, it felt like you knew from the beginning of this idea, as you said, you were going to come back to this area to make the distillery and forge forward with whatever plans. So how how close to where the distillery ended up did you guys grow up, and did you know the area pretty well?
Yeah, so that's right. The once we started to get our kind of detailed plans together, it was always going to be a distillery in Derbyshire, where we're from, and we grew up, around about 10 miles away from where the distillery is. Um, but more than that, the one of the reasons that we are in that specific location is, I used to, as a younger man, do a bit of mountain biking. And the distillery is located right on the banks of a river. And if you go through the back door, we back onto an ancient woodland. It's a woodland it's called Shining Cliff. And in any case, in the early 1990s, I used to ride my bike in those woods. So I knew of this kind of Edwardian Victorian era site when we were thinking about somewhere for our home.
And so the river is the River Derwent, and uh, it's you're not that old of a guy. I could see you still getting out on a mountain bike if you wanted to, but that's that's just me. Uh, the the idea that you're looking at this building in particular was interesting. Because it was a former wireworks factory, which will come up very shortly, um, and it had been in disuse from about 96 until you guys salvaged it and started using it again in 2017. So around the time that you were biking around it and seeing it, I would imagine it would have been, close to being shut down or recently shut down. So you probably had an image in your head of not necessarily a vacant building in disuse, but one that was freshly industrial, maybe closed, but still close enough in action that it could still look like something usable.
Yeah, that's right. I think, I mean, we got, let's say, three kind of criteria when we were looking for our brand home or the distillery home. One of which was, we wanted the distillery to be on a river, and that was kind of almost like a sense of romance. It's commonly, where you find distilleries in Scotland, either by the sea or by the river or by some other natural watercourse. Because, of course, back in the day, they were being established in places where, there wasn't a kind of public water connection they could link into. But in any case, so we had one of the requirements was we wanted the distillery to be by a river. We also were looking for, yeah, a brownfield site and something that got a bit of backstory, a bit of history to it that would, hopefully make for a nice home for the distillery. And then, yeah, thirdly, kind of selfishly, we wanted a reasonable commute from home, and yeah, like I say, it was kind of within 10 miles. So yeah, so those were the criteria. And then yeah, I knew of these buildings, because of the cycling I used to do behind them. And to my knowledge, they were huge buildings, and most of them are, most of them are sort of 50, 60,000 square feet, which was way more space than we thought we would need. We were a little bit naive with how much space we might need for warehousing, but we were looking for more like 5 to 10,000 square feet. And I, through some other kind of nice coincidences, I knew of the family that owned the site, so that the landlord, and I contacted them and said, "Hey, this is something we're looking to do. We're looking to start a whiskey distillery. We're looking for space in the area. Have you got any suitable buildings?" And actually, the landlord came back to me and said, "Yeah, I've got something. Might be suitable." So I think I went down, met him in February 2016, and it turns out all these big 50 to 60,000 square feet units. That was the main makeup of the site, but there was a couple of units right at the kind of the northern end of the site that together were 10,000 square feet. And Claire and I walked in, and there was let's just say, a fair bit of industrial history from 1996 that was still in the building, because I think the business had closed relatively quickly, and essentially I think they almost left and locked the doors. So I guess it was a bit of a mess, being polite, but it just had this kind of aura or feeling about it, and we both just felt it would be a great home for the distillery. So we it was handy in the sense it very much shortcutted our search for a brand home, because it was a site that I'd been aware of, and it so happened that they had some space which really fitted the bill, and it was bang on the River Derwent.
This site in particular, and let's call it the site. That's fine. When let's say you've got the building, you're able to finance it. Initial investment around 1.6 million pounds reportedly. The building itself, as we said, like, it required a bit of salvaging. Call it whatever what was in there that had to get cleaned out, updating whatever was. I think you're on the side of a river, so I'm sure there's some water stuff you got to fix up, and that's before you bring in any of the equipment that you need.
Right.
Plus, this is on a UNESCO World Heritage Site as well. So, how did you manage all of that on what I feel like 1.6 million pounds is a shoestring budget to do all of that?
Yeah, I mean, it was very much a shoestring budget, and I guess we also got in. At least our plans came together before we've all experienced some, crazy inflationary, cost increases. But I mean, it was very tight financially. We couldn't afford to have a consultant, kind of pull things together for us. So it was very much, us on site, every single day, managing the build, talking with the engineering firm that we used to do the detailed engineering of the distillery itself. And actually, I really enjoyed that. Back in the day, I studied mechanical engineering at university. So, although, I'd got kind of no real experience of working in a distillery or designing a distillery, a lot of the discussions, certainly during that construction phase, were, they were kind of topics I could at least get my mind around. And I think generally we found, most people that we needed to get on board as stakeholders. So, including the group that manages the UNESCO site. Most people were just really supportive. I think the fact that we were trying to bring some buildings, back to life. I think people bought into that process, and the former occupant, which was the Wireworks, the company was run by a guy called Richard Johnson, and they existed for 120 years, and they were a major part of our local community. They were certainly one of, if not the biggest employer. When the towns and villages around there are relatively small, and so there was this sense in which we were breathing new life back into this site that at one point had been a fairly core part of the community. And I think because of that, and I'd like to think people understood we were doing it in a sympathetic way. We enjoyed a lot of support, and the UNESCO team, generally speaking, their sense was, look, you've got some salvage work to do here on the building, but you're going to put it back into what they would consider to be a sort of light industrial use, which is what it was designed for in the first place in the 1870s. So they were definitely on board with things.
I like it. So something that I guess is coming on more and more when I interview English distilleries in particular is this idea that most of these distilleries are in areas where there just wasn't a distilling tradition. England as a whole did not have a lot of tradition distilling. It was mostly done in Scotland and Ireland and on the continent and imported rather than being on site in England proper. So before White Peak, whiskey had never been made, at least legally, in Derbyshire before. But there was a strong brewing tradition, and you have around 70 breweries operating. I know there were tax reasons and revenue reasons for England not having as much whiskey history as the other countries I mentioned. But to your knowledge, was there any reason that your area in particular didn't have any legal distillation, or was that just part and parcel?
Yeah, and I don't know of any particular reason, David. I mean, sometimes these things just, develop through circumstances of the day. And indeed, there's the kind of cluster points in the UK for whiskey distillation were Scotland, and I guess the obviously in Ireland as well. And I suppose both countries would perhaps lay claim to the sort of the first move, certainly in the United Kingdom. But I don't know. I don't know the reason, but certainly as far as we've been able to tell, there'd never been any whiskey made in Derbyshire. We have found a company, and in fact, you can in some of the kind of thrift shops in the area, you can sometimes find bottles that have the company's name on that actually blended whiskey in this area. I think they had some sort of blending operation, but they weren't making the spirit themselves. So that history didn't exist. But you're right, there was an enormous heritage in brewing beer, and certainly in the Derbyshire region to today is it's still an important centre for beer making. And actually, just on the southern tip of our county, there's a town called Burton-on-Trent, which is the kind of historical home of beer making, certainly in England. So the region is, let's say, well known for that brewing heritage.
And going back to when you were not only dreaming, but when you were really starting to turn this dream into a reality. So you broke ground, quote unquote, broke ground because it wasn't flat ground or empty ground at that point, but December 2016 or so. So you're thinking about it beforehand a couple of years. So let's go back maybe 2014 or so when you're really like, okay, I want to do this. You've convinced Claire this is a project you want to really move forward on. This is 12 years ago. Not a lot of distilleries in England were up and running at that point. We had the earliest ones, the English Distillery Company. They might have even still been St. George at that point.
Yeah, they were. Yeah.
Yeah. So, just a couple of them. Now we've got 22 up and running with 50 plus, no, more than that up and running. Sorry. 45 are part of the English Whiskey Guild, a bunch more than that in various states of building and permitting and all of that.
Yeah, I think we're up
Um,
to 61. I mean, that was the last count, and
yeah,
it may have changed since then.
right. It's day by day. It seems to be changing, which is a good thing. Um, so you mentioned you had a couple of these inspirations, but also that you didn't have the money for a consultant to come in and figure out how you were going to build it out and other than that. So how did you? And as you said, you didn't. You had a experience as a whiskey enthusiast with SMWS, and I saw in one interview that's how Claire got into it was by drinking with you and your father.
Yeah.
Um, so, but with no disrespect at all, no whiskey making experience before that. So, how did you go about gaining that knowledge and getting the guidance you needed to figure out how to build this out without the resources that you needed?
Yeah, I think so I guess one of the things that I kind of sort of learned during my previous career is there's lots of smart people in the world, and you as an individual are never going to have all the answers to all of the questions. So I've always had this perspective that it's fine to acknowledge that you're not the expert in every matter, and essentially ask people that perhaps have that expertise or experience that you're looking for. And that was kind of my approach when we were getting our plans together. So there were certain things that, in terms of whiskey making, for example, I'd got some kind of outline ideas about. I mean, I'd been to visit a lot of distilleries, but then, I was kind of just soaking up information from as many sources as I could get. And is often the case in life. You can have, after a couple of phone calls, you'll get people recommending that you should go and speak to so and so, and you suddenly find that there's roads leading to people who have got information. And by and large, I found in our industry people are happy to share. I think it's a difficult industry to start in, and I think a lot of people that perhaps have gone through that process or work in the industry and have seen the cyclical nature of it appreciate that. And I think they're often generous with their kind of help and guidance as a consequence. But so that was kind of, I guess, my kind of approach was to just try and get as much information from as many sources as I could. And then, of course, you've got to sieve through all of that and decide what you think is right for the business that you want to build. And then allied with that, one of our first hires was our main distiller, and that was just at the same time when we were doing the basic engineering and trying to get some basic costings together with the engineering firm that we work with. And so it meant that the first kind of paid member of the team was our distiller, and he was with the company for 12 months, maybe just give or take a few weeks before we were distilling anything. And so it meant that we could build that knowledge into the kind of the process of finalizing the detailed engineering, and then also in parallel with all of that, thinking in more detail about the style of whiskey that we may make.
Love it.
And one of the kind of interesting stories is that obviously I recognized that there was a huge whiskey industry north of the border in Scotland, but I was also slightly cautious of kind of, let's say, seeking all our advice from sort of north of the border, because in my head, at least, rightly or wrongly, I just thought there's a danger here that we build a Scotch whiskey distillery in England, and that would, in my mind, be a huge mistake, because it's an opportunity lost to do something different, and also the in Scotland, they're very good at making Scotch whiskey. So, let's not take them head on at that game. So one of the things I did is I started to look elsewhere, and there was the American kind of craft distilling scene, not just whiskey, but certainly in whiskey, had probably been going for a good decade or so before we've seen this resurgence in England, and it meant there were new distilleries setting up in the US, and people getting into making whiskey in a way that we perhaps hadn't experienced at that time in the UK. So yeah, I was kind of just following the news flow from this side of the pond, and there was one person in particular whose name kept appearing, and so I reached out to him on LinkedIn, and kind of to this day, I'm not sure why he accepted my invite, because he would have had this inbound kind of email from some guy that had worked in financial roles and a former engineer, but never worked in kind of drinks or spirits. But and he turned out to be pretty fundamental to shaping our early plans. And that guy's name is a guy called Chip Tate, who started Balcones Distillery in Texas. And so I got a lot of very supportive advice from Chip. I actually spent a week with him in Waco, Texas, in very early 2017, and that really kind of helped to shape some of our plans for distillery. And also he was extremely generous guy, and I think gave me just a kind of a little boost in confidence that yes, we could do this. And so Chip was very instrumental in those early days in refining the plans for what subsequently became White Peat Distillery.
I was surprised to hear when it's come up in other interviews, but I was surprised to hear about the connection with Chip, because a lot of, I guess, I don't hear a lot in English distilleries about these cross-Atlantic connections that much. But in White Peak, you've got multiples. You've got Chip at the beginning. You've got Brian with Never Say Die in the last couple of years. And I don't know, I like that. I like more of that cross-national idea transfer, because Chip created something very different with Balcones. And even though, and I've said this publicly, so it's not going to be a headline, like, I'm not generally a fan of their whiskey style. I respect a lot what they did and what they've created, what he created. So and also what he's done with still making and his life after Balcones in the last couple of years. So it's I love the transfer of information there. Just for sake of time, I'm going to move on to the next question, but so we'll get into the process in a little bit, but one of the questions that I had was, you told Honest to a Malt, I think last year, that the brand Wireworks, so which is the brand name of the whiskey, notably, you were inspired. Sorry, this is a circuitous lead into the question.
Right.
You were inspired by the way Bruichladdich did their branding, where they have a name for the whiskey line, a name for the gin line, and they're separate even though it's under the company umbrella. So Wireworks is the whiskey brand, named, of course, for the Wireworks factory that you are in. Oh my goodness, the name of the cliffs just went right out of my head.
Shining Cliff.
Shining Cliff. Thank you.
Yeah.
Shining Cliff, the name of the gin for the area. So the brand names, again, are separate. They're meant to be like, okay, this is our gin brand. This is our whiskey. You're not going to get a Wireworks gin. It's separate. But you told Honest to a Malt that when you were filling those first few casks, first 100 or so casks, you didn't really have a brand name in mind at that point, or you were still working on the brand name.
That's correct.
So did you, after those 100 casks, did you have to, go back and rebrand those casks they set aside for something else? Or what I guess I'm curious about that, but also the idea of like we're distilling something. We don't know what we're going to call it yet, but we're distilling something.
Yeah, I mean, um, and that's that is the way things happen, David. So you know, again, Claire and I are not from a sales and marketing background, so I guess a very legitimate approach to starting any business would be with that kind of sales and marketing hat on, and understanding from the get-go exactly how your product and your brand and your service is going to fit in the market, and how it's going to be marketed and how it's going to be branded and all of those types of things. That's not how we started. We much more, and this is, you could say this is kind of naivety, but much more a case of we're going to make the best whiskey we can. We're going to make whiskey that kind of speaks to the place where we're making it, and has that kind of provenance story. And if we do a good job of that, then people will buy it. And we'll think about the kind of branding and sales and marketing a bit further down the road. And so, that's what we did. And we've ended up, as you say, with, I guess, different brands. I mean, principally, we are 95% a single malt whiskey distillery. So the Wireworks brand is, the overwhelming majority of the business. But the reason we're called White Peak Distillery is because we're in an area of the UK where there's a national park called the Peak District. It was the first national park to have that sort of designation from the UK government. And the northern half of the Peak District is called the High Peak or the Dark Peak. And the southern half is called the White Peak. And so the distillery is kind of on the boundary of the southern half of the Peak District. And so we had a sense that White Peak might just kind of travel a bit further than using the name Derbyshire, which is the name of the county we're in, kind of rightly or wrongly. And yeah, when you're starting a company, you do the usual things. You kind of, in the UK, you have to, if you're going to have a limited company, it has to be registered with Companies House. And so you go to Companies House, you check what names might be available. You then think, well, we're going to need a website. So what domain names might be available? And we did kind of those checks and balances on various names, but we ended up with, White Peak Distillery because of our location, and, because we needed a name for the business that we could use kind of legally and on a website, etc. But at that time, we did not have any idea what the brand of the whiskey would be. But, and you kind of, you pointed this out, we got a strong sense that we were going to release a gin in the early days, partly to help with cash flow, also to help with our visitor experiences that we started, well before we had whiskey available. And we'd obviously, through our lived experiences, we'd seen what Bruichladdich had done, and they in my mind quite cleverly separated the two brands, the Botanist gin from their various whiskies, to the point where certainly many gin drinkers in the UK would perhaps be surprised that the gin was made by a whiskey distillery. But we thought that was a smart thing to do. And I'm not saying, that's the only way to look at it, but we kind of knew that if the first brand that we put out was a gin, then there might be a sense when we subsequently launched the whiskey, which was always going to be our main product, but it just comes later because of the maturation period, because of the order of those two products coming out, that people might think, these are the gin people now having a go at whiskey. And of course, the reverse is true. But it's just the order that the products get released. And so we liked that kind of concept, and we didn't have a discussion with Bruichladdich, but it was kind of, that was our takeaway from the way they had branded their different spirits. And that's why we ended up with Shining Cliff Gin. And, that was launched again before we had a brand name for the whiskey.
And it should be said that you do have a connection, albeit tenuous, to Bruichladdich, where you have a cask of theirs.
I do, yeah. Yeah, I had a lovely, I mean, I've been to Islay a few times, but one of the trips was with my two brothers and my dad. And we visited a bunch of distilleries. Yeah, we had some good fun on the island, and we hadn't gone with a view that we might buy a cask of whiskey, but we arrived at Bruichladdich. This was back in the day when it was still sort of, I guess, independent, part of the Mark Rainier consortium. And there was an opportunity to buy a cask. And so, yeah, we turned up, did the distillery visit, and found out you could buy a cask. And certainly back in the day, the kind of, the entry point is financially was, just about attainable for myself and my younger brother in the end. So yeah, in 2007, we bought a cask from Bruichladdich. Actually turned 18 this May, so very recently, and we're about to get some of it bottled. But yeah, and ever since that first kind of visit, I've been back subsequently, and yeah, Bruichladdich has it's got a space in my heart, not just because of the cask, but I think partly because of the kind of Phoenix and the Flames type history that it has, and also just the history of at the distillery itself when you go visit.
You would not be the first podcast guest. I won't even say person, podcast guest who, to put it nicely, fell victim to Jim McEwen's very, very convincing chat about, you should really buy a cask of this now because you're going to regret it if you don't do it later. So I know a number of people who did that when, like you said, it was kind of bare bones. It was Jim, Mark, a handful of people there trying to resurrect the brand, not what it is today. So no, I love hearing that though. Um, so since you started, and before we get into your connection with Thornbridge, almost said Thornbridge Distillery, Thornbridge Brewery, have any other distilleries popped up in your county?
Not in our county. There is another distillery, kind of the other side of this Peak District National Park that I mentioned. But actually, in the kind of the wider region we're in, which in England's called the East Midlands, there's a relative kind of scarcity of distilleries. When you look at the map of the 60 odd English distilleries that now exist, there are some clusters around the country, but not in the area that we're in.
Gotcha. So, as you mentioned earlier, Derbyshire is known for many things. It's got a strong brewing tradition. It's got, one of them being Thornbridge. And I admit, I'm not a huge beer guy. I enjoy it occasionally. Certainly not enough to know like the international beer scene very well.
Yeah.
But I have, in just reading for this interview, Thornbridge is quite well known, it seems, and well regarded at that. So, for just the sake of time today, I am going to include some of the more specific process notes in show notes that will be available when this episode goes live. So please be sure to check the description of the episode for a link to the show notes, as well as to go onto the website. But I do want to talk about Thornbridge because that is where you get your live yeast.
Right.
Every Tuesday is Fresh Yeast Day.
You got it.
They're cropping yeast from the brewery because the yeast is still alive after the brewery. They're not driving it to death like you do at a distillery. So you collect the yeast, they bring it over, and you get to use it in your fermentation. I was reading one of the interviews that it took a little convincing at first to get Thornbridge on board because you were a brand new distillery. They don't know at that point how the project is going to turn out, how the whiskey is going to turn out. So there was hesitance at first, understandably, I think, to putting their name to something. Now, obviously, it seems like it's a very well-known relationship and everything is great. But from your perspective as a distiller who's coming to them to say, hey, we want to use your yeast, what was that initial conversation like?
Yeah, I mean, you're right, David. I think, and you can understand it. I think Thornbridge as a business has been, extremely successful, and they've been certainly going for at least 2 decades. So, yeah, when we were approaching them, probably back in 2017, yeah, they were well over a decade into their business. They'd already built a good reputation. So, yeah, there's a certain amount of jeopardy of, involved with associating themselves with a startup in a sector that doesn't hadn't previously existed in this part of the UK. Having said all that, I think the brewing team there, and a guy called Rob Lovett, who's their director of brewing. In fact, I was spent some time with Rob yesterday. I think he's been there since 2010, but I think he was curious. I think he was generally supportive in terms of well, this sounds like an interesting project, and if in the beer world, that's the kind of thing that I'm sure they'd have been doing. So I think from the brewers' perspectives, the brewing team, I think there was more of a kind of sense of, well, yeah, I mean, this is an interesting project. Kind of, why wouldn't we? I think we had a sense, although never directly kind of confirmed, that perhaps the marketing department were a little bit more cautious about, yeah, like I say, associating the Thornbridge brand with a kind of unknown startup. And so certainly in the early days, even once we established this Tuesday routine for, collecting the spent live brewer's yeast from their brewery, we were we were telling people that we were using spent brewer's yeast in our fermentation and as part of our whiskey making process. But we weren't sort of name checking Thornbridge per se in those early days. I mean, kind of for two reasons. One of which is, yeah, we certainly didn't want to end up in a situation where they could metaphorically pull the rug from under our feet because we were, kind of, hanging on their coattails too much. But then also, we had our own kind of sense of place, and also a kind of sense of this is something that we're building, and yeah, the Thornbridge yeast is a key part of certainly our history these days, but we wanted it to be about White Peat Distillery and what we were doing. So yeah, we were talking about the spent brewer's yeast, but it was kind of in an anonymous way. And then, like, as you say, I think over a period of time, we got to know Thornbridge well, and I think they became more comfortable with us, and that we were fit and proper people, and we weren't kind of here today and gone tomorrow. And so that relationship, I think, has really blossomed. And yeah, aside from the yeast, we are sharing casks, and we've laid down some whiskey with a totally different mash bill. In fact, it's going to be 5 years old in October this year, and that was a mash bill that, I mean, very much was kind of a decision made with the brewing team up there. So yeah, and in terms of individuals, there's a human story, I would say, of friendship, and also kind of fellow makers in this county of Derbyshire where we live.
I've got to know if you are willing to share what that different mash bill is.
Yeah, I mean, so all I can say is it's got kind of elements that you might expect from a kind of craft brewery. So there's going to be some dark malt in there, some chocolate malt, there's some oats, there's some beech smoked malt. Yeah, so something very different.
I mean, obviously I can't speak for what it will taste like or what it tastes like now, but interest wise, that sounds fascinating. So
Yeah, no,
plus
absolutely. And
I'll drink any spirit with oats in it. So
well, similarly, we hadn't got a real sense of direction in terms of what it might end up like, and it's still maturing away in our warehouse. But yeah, but yeah, just echo your comments, David. It certainly was an interesting project for us to do.
sure. So The profile of the distillery, and by that I'm talking specifically about the single malt, is light and fruity. It's not meant to be a super heavy dram at all, but fairly unique, if not fully unique, to English whiskey and English distilleries. There is a light peat running through it. You've got about a
Yeah.
10 ppm on the grain, ends up being between 4 and 6. You know, this is all kind of by the time it goes through the still, it's all sensory as opposed to like scientifically 10 ppm, but um, ends up being about 4 to 6 in the bottle or after distillation. So as of this was back in 2021, you were on an interview with Irish Whiskey Review. At that point, you were probably the only English whiskey distillery. There we go, with a lightly peated single malt as their core profile. So all of your single malt has that light peat in there. Um, as of now, 4 years later, as far as you know, is that still the case?
Yeah, as far as I know, David, that remains the case, and certainly that lightly peated house style, I think, has helped us, amongst other reasons, find a space in this market, and it probably constitutes, I'm going to say, at least 80% of all the spirit we've laid down. Just as an aside, we do work with a local farmer, so with some barley that's grown in our county. And that is floor malted in a traditional floor maltings a couple of 100 miles south of the distillery. Malting is called Warminster. And we've decided for that malt that it's going to be completely unpeated. So we do have some unpeated spirit. I think the oldest is just about turning 3, but the overwhelming majority is lightly peated. And yeah, absolutely, it's a point of difference between our distillery and the rest of the English market. And in fact, I think further afield in the UK, there aren't that many distilleries with a core spirit that's lightly peated.
Oh, for sure. Uh, it's and I love that you brought up the local barley. So it's mostly Chevalier barley, if not all Chevalier. So this is not a commonly used barley for whiskey making, though it's not really commonly used too much. Period anymore. It's one of the older varieties, but it is used sometimes in beer making. Um, you said in one of the interviews that this particular crop that you're getting locally is produced differently in terms of mashing and in the wash, besides being unpeated. So, what do you do differently with this batch than you do with your overall product?
Yeah, so with the local barley, and then there's not a lot of local barley in Derbyshire. It's quite a kind of rocky, hilly terrain, so it's more suited to kind of animals, kind of sheep and cows, rather than huge flat swathes of land where you can grow a crop nice and efficiently. So yeah, for the local barley, we kind of knew that as and when we bottle it, which at the time when we were first getting the local crops, was going to be a few years away, but we just decided that the conversation we wanted to have was around the fact that it's local barley, so that rather than just making the statement that it's local barley, it's kind of, well, so what? What does that mean in terms of what I'm going to taste? So what we decided to do at the mashing stage of our process is produce a cloudy wort. Now, normally speaking, we're trying to make a relatively clear wort to go into our fermentation, because that's going to help us develop some of the fruity notes that we want in our end spirit. But when in fact, we run the rakes constantly when we're mashing the local barley, and you end up with a cloudy wort, which ultimately leads to sort of more of the kind of biscuity, barley grain notes coming through into the spirit. And so the intention is that, yeah, when we do eventually bottle some of this whiskey made with the local barley, that kind of flavor profile is going to be in evidence. And then we can have a good conversation about, well, why is that? And then it kind of ties into the grain story and the local barley story. So we mash in a different way, and then also our cut points are different. So we went through the same process that most distilleries will go through, where they decide where they're going to take their kind of foreshots and faint cuts, and we just change them up for the local barley again to try and encourage some of those kind of maltier notes to be evident in the final spirit. So it was a really interesting process for us to go through as whiskey makers, and actually we've obviously been sampling, and it's indeed it's a totally different kind of flavor and aroma experience from our house style of lightly peated.
That was going to be my next question. Was you said it's turning about 3. Is it so far living up to the expectation that the direction that you thought it was going to go in?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think we're really pleased with the way it's gone. I think it would probably be wrong to say that in whiskey making, you're ever 100% certain what the outcome's going to be. You kind of you put your best foot forward, and you've got a real kind of sense of direction. But obviously, there's certain magic goes on in the cask that I don't think anyone's ever kind of 100% scienced to death. So I think in terms of our expectations, I would say it's probably exceeded them. But then, I'd also say, to give our team some, credit for that, we made some conscious decisions around how we would mash, around changing our cut points, that they kind of logically made sense in terms of what that should do to the spirit. But, how that manifests itself in the matured spirit is, of course, that's not easy to predict.
For sure. And I do want to also point out just briefly that putting aside the local barley, which sounds like it's going more towards the profile I'm about to talk about, in a county that has such a strong brewing tradition, I could easily see someone coming in and making a whiskey and a distillate that aims to lean into the malting side of things and a maltier, perhaps heavier spirit. And I think it's unexpected and kind of a great idea to go the opposite direction of this fruity fruity light style for your main whiskey, the one that you're going to be known for most outside of the area, and then being able to tie back other portions of this, like you're using a brewer's yeast, you're doing XYZ, but you're not tying yourself, as you used the phrase earlier, to the brewing tradition. You're really starting a new distilling tradition in the county. So I loved that idea. On the website, when I write this up, I'm also going to talk a little bit about the packaging design. I will give a shout out here to Claire. I know that was a big project of hers for about 15 to 18 months, designing the bottles for Wireworks in particular. And also this idea that from the beginning, the customer and visitor experience was going to be part of this.
Yes.
You're in an area of the country that I think you said the number earlier, just in case you didn't, I'll throw it here. You get 13 million visitors a year to the Peak District.
Yeah.
That's quite a bit. That's 20% of the population of the UK equivalency. It's a large population going there year to year. I mean, if you're not in the dead center of where people are going all the time, you're adjacent, you're very close. So, and being in the East Midlands too, you're not, it's going to work in my mind, but may not work in others. But like, you're not far north in Yorkshire. You're relatively close to the main centers of population, so you could do day trips to where you are.
Absolutely. And we refer to this area as well. It's also known as the Midlands, i.e., in the middle. And so just the whole connectivity, it's by car, by train, even by plane, works pretty well for us.
Absolutely. So, one of the questions I had is you're, you're not putting out a massive volume so far. As of May of this year, you had about 2,700 barrels in situ at the distillery. You're distilling about 2 barrels a day.
Yeah.
And I'm curious in our last few minutes that we've got to talk about the local, domestic, and international presence that you've gotten. Clearly, you've been winning a lot of awards across the range and across multiple well regarded award, what's the word, competitions. There we go. And I'm curious what the demand and response locally has been. And by locally, you can look at, I'm talking the 10-mile radius of where you are, and people visiting the Peak District, but also where you are distributed within England and the UK.
Yeah. So I think, as you said earlier, David, we'd always got a sense that um, that kind of visitor experience offering, and indeed, this kind of just broader whiskey tourism was going to play an important part for our business. And I know there are challenges in the US for the kind of the cellar door kind of sale concept, but certainly here in England, that's perfectly legitimate. And indeed, our cellar door is still our biggest channel in terms of sales. So yeah, I'd say in terms of local support, yeah, we enjoy I think a lot of regular customers, and I think there's a lot of people who are maybe new to whiskey and we're curious about what on earth is going on here in Derbyshire, and then also whiskey fans who I think there's a lot out there close to us who are just delighted that they've got a whiskey distillery nearby. So I think locally we've enjoyed a lot of support, a lot of that on the back of visitor experiences, but indeed that's pulling people to distillery from further and further afield. We had some people along yesterday from France. We regularly see people from the Netherlands, from Germany, and as you say, there is this footfall of 13 million people coming to the Peak District area. So to some extent, they haven't got a massive diversion in their journey as long as we can let them know we're there to come see us. So yeah, the local market is very important for us. Further afield, we are stocked. I'd say pretty much throughout England. We have we some of our whiskey in Scotland as well, which is there's no sense in which we're trying to take the Scotch whiskey market head on, but they're just people who are interested in, well, let's just say world whiskey, and we found some interest up there, but certainly throughout England, and then more recently in the last couple of years, we've started to export in a selected way. I think my perspective is that it's difficult enough to start a whiskey brand in your kind of home country. So that just gets amplified in terms of difficulty when you're exporting. And yeah, because we're a small company with limited resources, we don't have the benefit of putting kind of boots on the ground. So it's kind of fly out whenever we can to support our importer distributors. And so we've got a small number of export markets, but including countries like Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, and hopefully soon South Korea. So I know some of those places are relatively far apart, some are closer than others, but there's a bit of a hub there, and obviously those are markets where whiskey, there are whiskey consumers. It's a known spirit, so we're not kind of trying to introduce people to a spirit that they've never heard of at the same time as introducing them to a country that they may never have known of and made whiskey. So and we're enjoying some some success. I think it takes time to build a brand, so that's certainly I think our perspective is whiskey's a long-term game, but it's so far the whiskey's been going down well, and I think that's helping it travel.
Wonderful. So I do want to leave just a minute or two for us to debrief after, but I'll throw you the last question for now, which is you're about a decade in. This is your it's not your first career. Yeah, as you said, you worked in finance, you worked and you trained in engineering, you worked at a gold mining operation for a bit
Yeah,
as
yeah, I
well.
did. Yeah.
So not your first career, but seems like you're. It feels like you're content to have this be your last career, and to take this as far as it will go. So, what do you feel like you and Claire want the legacy of White Peak Distillery to be?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think this kind of comes, full circle back to the discussion we were having around the Wireworks brand. The Wireworks, started in the 1870s, unfortunately closed down in the mid 1990s, but for certainly 120 years, they enjoyed, enormous success for most of that time through being innovative in the kind of engineering sense, in the sense of making great products made to last. And I think we feel that kind of sense of legacy that in the decisions we're making kind of day in day out about running this business and laying down whiskey, that we kind of really hope that in another 100 years time, when we're no longer around to have the conversation, but that people will be talking fondly about Wireworks whiskey in the same way that we are kind of celebrating the Wireworks that occupied this site between us. So yeah, pretty much all the decisions we take, we always have this kind of view that how is this going to be seen in the long term? How are these decisions that we make today going to kind of stand up to the test of time? So I think, in terms of what we are hoping for the business in the long term and our whiskey in the long term, is that it's going to be around and enjoyed, and some of this kind of the stories that we're laying down on podcasts like this, David, may get repeated on whatever the device of the day is by the time we get there. But that's our long-term perspective and our long-term hope for the business.
Well, Max, thank you so much for coming on, talk about White Peak Distillery. Hang out with me for just a moment after we finish recording. This has been another episode of the Whiskering Podcast. Please follow, like, and subscribe wherever you can. Take a look at the show notes. When this episode goes live, you will see more information that we didn't get to talk about today on air. And this is a distillery you're going to want to keep an eye on. And I know for the nerds out there who listen, because I'm one of you, there's going to be information on there that you want to see about how they make the whiskey and what goes into it. So thank you all for listening, and I'll see you all next week.